This presentation is brought to you by theKathleenWellsShow.com.
Hi, this is Kathleen Wells with the Progressive Voices Network. Earlier this week, I interviewed Professor Lawrence Davidson. Our interview centered around Zionism and his thoughts of the current events taking place in Gaza. Professor Davidson is a Middle East expert and a frequent guest on the Kathleen Wells Show. His analysis centers on the reality of American conduct in the Middle East, and he has performed his analysis in conjunction with an awareness of the propaganda that has permeated this debate for the past 65 years. Professor Davidson has become an outspoken and unflinching critic of the U.S. alliance with Israel and the Zionist treatment of the Palestinian people. This interview originally aired on KCAA AM 1050. Welcome to the Kathleen Wells Show. I'm Kathleen Wells, your host, and here we are again. We're going to discuss Israel and Palestine again because, in fact, I think a ceasefire has just been announced a few hours ago. I'm not certain, last night, actually. But there's a massacre that has taken place, a massacre of Palestinians. My guest today is a frequent guest on my show, Professor Lawrence Davidson, and I was prompted to bring him on. I've had many people on in the last, 5 weeks, Jewish Americans, and I had one Palestinian. Professor Davidson is a Jewish American. He's going to offer, I was prompted to bring him on because I read 2 articles that he has written. His website is tothepointanalysis.com, and 2 articles that he has written has prompted me to invite him to be a guest on my show. As I mentioned before, he's a frequent guest on my show. One of the articles is titled Deconstructing the Zionist View of Gaza's Horror. I mean, that title in and of itself was intriguing to me, and I wanted to bring him on to sort of elucidate or elaborate or clarify or to talk about this article that he's written. So, Professor Davidson, thank you for joining me on the Kathleen Wells Show.
Sure. Thank you, Kathleen. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, I hear you perfectly fine. You're coming through loud and clear. I was, first I want to say that you're a professor and that your academic work has centered on the history of American formulations with the Middle East.
Right.
And your analysis tries to bring citizen awareness. Is that an apt way to put it?
I think that's accurate, yeah.
That's accurate. So the article that we were talking about, or the article that I read of yours on your website, Deconstructing the Zionist View of Gaza's Horror. And what prompted you to write this is that you had received a letter written by the executive editor of the American Jewish Congress.
Right. And he had actually written a letter to the Boston Globe, and the Globe printed the letter as an op-ed. And obviously he gave the Israeli point of view about things, which essentially laid all the blame on Hamas and the Palestinians. So I thought, since I had actually gotten the manuscript or the version of the letter on my email, that I could take it and tear it apart.
Mm-hmm. And you write that he lives, David Harris is his name. He's the executive editor of the American Jewish Congress. This letter appeared in the Boston Globe, and you write that David Harris lives in a very tightly defined world, and that it is a world defined by a set of unquestioned assumptions which are prescribed by a thoroughly assimilated ideology. Elaborate on that. That's a mouthful, right?
I know. That's what happens when you're a professor for 30 plus years. I mean, that's what happens. But essentially, Zionists, people who support Israel, whether they're Jewish or they're Christian, I mean, there are many Christian Zionists too, essentially see Israel as, as as a legitimate state, even in its Zionist form. What that means is that, okay, there's something out there called Israel. It occupies part or most of historic Palestine. And it's built on a certain type of ideology. And that ideology is Zionism. And that ideology says that this state is designed first and foremost for one group of people. Okay? And that group of people happen to be Jews. My position is that building a state on that basis actually makes the state illegitimate. Not because it's a state for Jews, but because it's a state for one group exclusively. However, given the history of European Jewry, there's a real buy-in by Zionists, by those Jews who are Zionists, to the historical necessity for a Jewish state. And so they set it up. They came in with the British after World War I. They set up this state, and essentially you develop laws and practices that essentially give the favored group, in this case the Jews, special privileges within the state, and this leads ultimately to discrimination against outgroups. Okay? And given this ideology, it can't go any other way. It's a logical progression. If you set up a state for one group in an area where there's many non-group people, the laws and the practices of your state are going to start to segregate and give economic and social privileges to one group that you don't give to another group. And when the non-group people start to resist, as almost inevitably they will, then in fact what you have is it turns racist. Okay, it turns racist, and the assumption is that resistance in this case is anti-Semitism. So I think that's the kind of ideology and worldview that Harris and most Zionists are tied into, and they never ever question it. And you can see that by the fact that in Harris's letter, for instance, to the Boston Globe, all fault lies with Palestinians. And the simple fact that when the Zionists came into Palestine, took the land, and started slowly but surely disinheriting and disenfranchising the local indigenous people, and they were going to generate resistance. But the resistance, even though it's inevitable and logical, never is recognized by the Zionists as legitimate. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, this is a real blind spot.
It's a real blind spot. You speak about, when you first started talking, you were talking about the historical, and I want to say historical/biblical right for Israel to exist.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Most of the 19th and 20th century modern Zionists who set up, who worked to set up the state of Israel were not religious people. They were secular. But Palestine became the center of their interest because of the biblical connection, even though most of them didn't believe that it was real. But it's become obviously a very convenient kind of rationale for the state of Israel. And Christian Zionists, are really, really very big on this. Most of them are Christian fundamentalists, and they've got this hardcore belief in Israeli, that modern Israelis and modern Jews are somehow genetically ancient Hebrews. I mean, I've had this experience myself, which is very weird. But anyway, yeah, I mean, many people assume that if you had a Jewish state or something that passed for a Hebrew state of Israel or Judea 2,000 years plus ago, that somehow that gives you the right of sovereignty over the same territory, 20 centuries later. I mean, it's kind of, from an historian's point of view, it's like really wacky. Mm-hmm. But if you've got the power, you've got the guns to make it stick, then there you are.
Mm-hmm. Well, also, you've mentioned this before, you say that the discriminated population's legitimate right to resist. I mean, you were discussing that earlier, that in the Zionist view are supporters of Israel, they don't believe that the Palestinians have the right to exist, and they also characterize Hamas as a terrorist organization.
Right. It's quite convenient. I mean, essentially, the Palestinians have been pushed into violence. That they've never been negotiated with in good faith, and we can go as far back as the period of British occupation to test that theory out. And they've been left very little choice but to resist violently. And there's an old adage, I guess, that is usually correct, and that is the violence of the oppressed usually rises to the level of the violence of the oppressor. But of course, the Palestinians don't have the kind of military machinery that the Israelis do. But I mean, they have to do the best they can with what they've got. But their right to resist, is in fact recognized in international law. Now, you can argue that attacking civilians is not legitimate, and I would agree with that. It's a very immoral kind of tactic. However, both sides do it, right? Mm-hmm. And the Israelis actually kill vastly larger numbers of civilians than do the Palestinians. So, you want to point a finger in one direction, then somebody's going to come along and point a finger in the other direction. Mm-hmm. If the Israelis don't like the tactics that the Palestinians used, there's a way out. They can negotiate a two-state settlement, but they never have done that. In my estimation, they've never done it in good faith.
Mm-hmm. They've never done it in good faith, but talk to me about the likelihood or the practicality of there being a two-state solution.
It's not going to happen. It's dead on the table. I mean, it's not going to happen because the Israelis are not interested in it. What they want is the territory. They want the land. Now, at best, we're in the Israeli scenario. What the Palestinians can expect is ghettos, enclaves, in which they are sort of pushed into these small territories, Bantustans, if you want to use that kind of term out of South Africa, and everything that happens in their territory, economic, security, everything, will be controlled by the Israelis. That's the best they can expect. That's not a state, right? These enclaves will be cut off from each other, and that's not a state. So the two-state solution is not there. It's not going to happen. It probably never was viable, given Israeli long-term ambitions on the territory, and so I think it's just a pie in the sky.
It's just pie in the sky. We're speaking with Professor Lawrence Davidson. He lectured at University in Westchester, Pennsylvania. His academic work is centered on the history of American foreign relations in the Middle East, and his analysis and commentary can be found at his website, tothepointanalysis.com. We're going to take a break. Professor Davidson, how do you feel about taking comments and questions, taking calls?
Okay.
You're okay with that?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so we're going to take a break. When we come back from the break, let me say, if you're interested in calling in and if you have a question or a comment for Professor Davidson, you may call the toll-free number 1-888-909-1050. That's 1-888-909-1050. So we'll be right back.
This is Tara Devlin, a.k.a. Pterodactyl.
Welcome back to the Kathleen Wells Show. I'm Kathleen, your host. My guest today is Professor Lawrence Davidson. He's an expert on the Middle East. In fact, his studies have focused on the Middle East, and he tries to raise citizen awareness. We have a call, but before we take the call, I wanted us to step back, and I wanted you to define what is Zionism. Define Zionism. What is it?
Yeah, Zionism is essentially a political movement that, in its modern form, begins in the second half of the 19th century, and the movement is designed to bring about a Jewish state. Okay, and of course, within the Zionist within the context of this movement, it creates a rationale for why the Jews need a state, and why it would be legitimate to have it. But essentially, Zionism is essentially a political movement designed to create a state for the Jews.
Mm-hmm. A political movement designed to create a state for the Jews.
A national home, a state.
A national home for the Jews. Okay, why don't we take a call from Elizabeth? Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi there. Thank you for taking my call, and thank you for always having such interesting and very knowledgeable guests on your show. Professor Davidson, I hope that I'm not asking this question too early in your program, but I know that you must know about the recent ceasefire agreement and agreement to also continue discussing conditions of a ceasefire. But I'm very concerned about whether or not it's actually going to work for several reasons. And I was hoping you discuss some of these things. One, what was the real objective of Israel's recent aggression and what they often refer to as mowing the lawn? And second, I don't know if you're familiar with a report which was published in 2009, but it was an article on a joint study of Tel Aviv University and European University about how ceasefires ended, and it was published in the Huffington Post. And what they determined in this study was that it was Israel who breached 79% of ceasefires with the Palestinians, and not as Israel often says that it is. And then in 2012 and again recently, they continue to breach their own agreements. Have I asked you too many questions? And also that they use the Hannibal policy in this war.
A Hannibal policy?
Where Hamas was in a battle when they entered Gaza. Hamas was close to capturing an Israeli soldier.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and then Israel decided to kill him rather than to allow him to be captured.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. Professor Davidson, did you get all that?
Yes.
Okay, I didn't.
Sorry.
The goal or the objective of the Israelis was to destroy Hamas as a political force. I think that was their primary goal, which would then allow Mahmoud Abbas's people from the Palestinian National Authority to move back into Gaza and take control. The Israeli arrangements and their ability to work with Abbas is much, much higher. Abbas really has given up the whole notion of physical resistance to the Israelis. So obviously, he being in control of Gaza would be much more favorable as far as the Israelis are concerned. So on the one hand, I think the primary goal was to destroy Hamas. And as a secondary goal, I think that the Israelis have always had a feeling or a theory or an assumption, I guess, and that is if you hit somebody hard enough, they'll stop, resisting. Historically, this has never worked. This has never worked. I mean, where you can see, particularly in World War II, for instance, massive bombing of Germany or the Blitz over London. These things never brought those countries to their knees. And the same can be said with the Japanese. Until you had the atomic bomb, nothing, the fire bombings of the Japanese cities did not result in their surrender. Anyway, the Israelis, for some reason, have this bee in their bonnet, and that is massive retaliation will cause the other guy to stop doing whatever he's doing. And they've never shaken it. They've never questioned it. So anyway, I think those are the two motivations that kind of worked on the Israelis when it came to Gaza. The Israelis never, as far as I'm concerned, as far as my research and my reading of the scenarios, they never negotiate in good faith with the Palestinians. And so that's one of the reasons that the Palestinians, that Hamas, for instance, they take nothing that the Israelis say for granted, or do they trust them? And they know that the Israelis will break their word. So, for instance, in this latest ceasefire, which brings us back to 2012, which was supposed to lift elements of the siege, which the Israelis never did. Now we're back to that part where say the Gaza fishermen are supposed to go out. They're supposed to be able to go out to 6 miles, and this sort of stuff. It's predictable that they won't do it, that the Israelis won't do it. They'll find some reason to shoot the fishermen. They'll find some reason that, you can't bring cement into Gaza because it's being used in the tunnels, and they can't rebuild. The Israelis are simply not to be trusted. And I think, actually, I'm not the only one who feels that way. I'll bet you that there's a whole lot of people in the middle echelon of the State Department who feel that way.
Mm-hmm. So did he answer your question, Elizabeth?
Yes, he didn't refer to the study that Israel breaches 79%.
Yeah, even Tel Aviv University comes up with the same kind of thing, that you can't trust the Israelis to do what they sign on the dotted line that they will do.
Okay, but I wanted to follow up, though, with something else. You used the word retaliation, that that's really what Israel was doing, but didn't really this aggression against Gaza begin with Israel's false accusation that Hamas had kidnapped and killed 3 Israeli yeshiva students? And then
Yeah, that was yeah, I've written about this, actually. I mean...
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. You're absolutely correct. I mean, what Netanyahu did was accuse Hamas of masterminding the kidnapping and murder of these three settler young men, and used that as an excuse to start a almost random roundup of both Hamas and other elements within the West Bank, and also to turn up the economic screws on Gaza and to send jet bombers into Gaza to bomb selected targets. So the problem with that is that there's no corroborating evidence. That everything points to a sort of opportunistic kind of kidnapping. These three kids were caught on the road by the wrong people who took an opportunistic advantage to take revenge on them. Quite recently, another Israeli-American who had moved to Israel, this is just last week, decided he was going to go hiking in the hills somewhere outside of Jerusalem, and now nobody can find him. I mean, so these things go on a lot, and there's no reason to believe that this was a planned operation of Hamas. It doesn't matter, because Netanyahu just used it. When he started his almost random roundup of people in the West Bank and started attacking Gaza, Hamas responded.
Yes, but if I can, and Israel killed Palestinians in both Gaza and in the West Bank before Hamas ever initiated a rocket.
Yeah, I mean, but I think that...
they weren't...
I think, yes.
It was Hamas who was retaliating.
Yeah, I mean, I think that from a logical and objective standpoint, you are right, okay? From the standpoint of reported news, the story becomes selective and distorted. So you and I can say this on KCAA, and I wonder just how many listeners who are, engaged with the topic say, well, this can't possibly be true.
Mm-hmm. And that goes back to our media. So talk to me, Professor Davidson. Thank you, Elizabeth, for your phone call, for your questions. Talk to me, Professor Davidson, about how the media is spewing propaganda, how the media is one-sided and failing to inform the American people on this particular issue.
Well, it's been that way for a very, very long time. The United States has always seen Israel as a legitimate operation, Zionism having a legitimate goal, and from the very beginning, in fact, from the time of Woodrow Wilson in the First World War, the United States has, generally speaking, lent more and more and more support for the notion of a Jewish state. And when the government does that, then the general media are going to follow, generally speaking, the same line. And considering that the United States comes out of a Judeo-Christian tradition, and the Jews are part of that same tradition, and the opposition are Arabs who most Americans don't know from, it's not surprising that most media is going to follow a line that supports people that are kind of like us, and And certainly that's the case when you start talking about the Bible and, Hebrews who are returning to their ancient home. And, all that kind of stuff resonates with lots of Christian Americans. Where are the Palestinians? And people don't even know who they are. It's not surprising that the media kind of takes that slant. Now, that's been actually changing somewhat over the last 10 or so years. I remember in the 1970s, I was in Canada at the time, getting up on a radio show and saying kind of the same thing I'm saying now, and there was a bloody explosion in and this radio program, they almost kicked it off the air. That's probably not going to happen in this case. So the times have changed a bit.
Mm-hmm. The times has changed a bit. Okay, in your book, Foreign Policy, Inc., Privatizing America's National Interests, you talk about the fact that U.S. foreign policy formulation it has been centralized in powerful lobbies rather than in the White House or the State Department.
Right. Most federal government policy, domestic and foreign, is in response to the demands and the needs of very powerful lobby groups or special interests. That's why, the NRA, the gun lobby, can get away with stopping rational gun laws, even though people are going into schools and blasting them apart. So when it comes to foreign policy, and particularly policy towards the Middle East, the strongest special interest or lobby is the Zionist lobby, and it's been that way at least since Harry Truman's day. Mm-hmm. That's why you can have a shift, a sort of slow but general shift in public opinion away from carte blanche support of Israel, but yet the Senate will still vote unanimously to support Israel.
Okay, we're going to take a break now, and when we come back from the break, we're going to talk about your other piece, the liberal Zionist dilemma. You give an analysis. We're speaking with Professor Lawrence Davidson on KCAA. Come back with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Kathleen Wells Show. My guest is Professor Lawrence Davidson. His work has centered on the reality of American conduct in the Middle East and has performed his analysis in conjunction with an awareness of the propaganda that has permeated this debate for the past 65 years. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about the media. When we're talking about the media, we're talking about the spewing of propaganda. That's the way I see it. What about you, Professor Davidson?
Well, it's certainly the spewing of a certain point of view that goes along with the desires of the power structure. Mm-hmm. There's very, very few organizations that, unless they have a lot of money behind them and nobody's opinion, who aren't going to essentially inform their presentation of controversial issues to the desires of those people who support that media, either through advertising or donations or what have you. And so you probably saw that. You've probably come and seen this happen yourself. Where if you've got something that's very, very controversial, you're going to hear about it, and there's going to be reactions and pressures not to do it again. That's kind of how things go. If you want to call it propaganda, yeah, it's propaganda.
Okay, now let's talk about your other article, The Liberal Zionist Dilemma. You've given an analysis. That piece can be found at tothepointanalysis.com. In it, you write that, you simply cannot adhere to the principle of universal civil and political rights and at the same time support a Zionist state.
Yeah.
Elaborate on that thought.
Well, I mean, there are Zionists out there who try to maintain a liberal position. And when we say liberal here, what we mean is these are people who, under normal circumstances, say within the milieu of American politics, support a broad application of civil and civil rights, civil and human rights. Okay? So essentially they believe that everyone should have the civil rights, the ability to have civil rights, to be treated equally before the law, and to have citizenship rights, and essentially to be treated with a certain level of equality with their peers. Okay, that's a liberal position. However, if we're talking about Israel, Israel is not designed as a liberal state. It's designed as a Jewish state, a state for one group only, which has led over time to the application of policies and laws that discriminate against non-Jews. And again, I want to say this clearly. This is not a function of their being Jewish. Okay, this is a function of designing a state for one group in the midst of lots of other groups, non-privileged groups. And so it doesn't matter if you're going to do this kind of thing. It doesn't matter whether you're Jewish or little green men from Mars. It doesn't matter. You are going to end up with a racist kind of scenario. That's what's happened. So how then do you maintain a liberal position which calls for equality and civil and human rights for everybody and support a state that denies that? Well, you can't. I mean, people do try to do this, but actually it's a contradiction, and so these liberal Zionists, so-called liberal Zionists, are really in a very untenable position, particularly because their position is not appreciated within the Zionist movement, and there's more increasing pressure on them to toe the line, if you will, the Zionist political line, and salute the Israeli flag and stop criticizing Israel because it's a racist state. I mean, okay, so if that's the situation, then these people have a choice. They either, continue to be liberal, and that requires them to stop being Zionists, or continue to be Zionists, and then toss their liberal principles out the window.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to take one more break, and when we come back from the break, we're going to talk about what has been the result of this recent onslaught onto Palestinians, Gazans.
Okay.
Yeah, what can be expected from this? We'll talk about that when we come back from the break. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back with Professor Lawrence Davidson. Welcome back to the Kathleen Wells Show. My guest is Professor Lawrence Davidson. Professor Davidson has become an outspoken and unflinching critic of the U.S. alliance with Israel and the Zionist treatment of the Palestinian people. I mean, don't you think that's been clear in just listening to him for the last, 50 minutes? I think that's accurate, don't you think, Professor Davidson?
I think that's accurate.
Yeah, that's accurate. So my question to you now is, what will be the result? What has come from the recent war, the recent massacre, the recent onslaught onto the Gazan people?
Right. I think that those people who suspected that Israeli behavior smacked of a sort of genocidal kind of motivation, or at the least ethnic cleansing. I mean, this has become much clearer. And so, for instance, the numbers of people who have joined, for instance, a group called Jewish Voices for Peace, which is an anti-Zionist American Jewish group, those numbers have gone up exponentially. They really have gone up a lot. And so almost all of the groups that in the United States that have traditionally protested Israel and its behavior have gotten many, many, many more members. So, and I think that's true in Europe too. The boycott movement has had a big boost. So essentially what this whole episode did, besides, turning the Gazans and, killing so many Gazans and ruining their economy, such as it was, and injuring all these people and attacking UN schools and all. What it has done is it really showed the violent face of Zionism and given the movement in protest against this a big boost. Unfortunately, those in charge of Israel, the Israeli leadership, as well as most Israeli people, don't understand what's happening. They don't understand how their own behavior is their worst enemy. All they see in this is that, we're acting in self-defense. I mean, if you talk to an Israeli or an American Zionist or American Israeli person living in the United States or something like that, I mean, they will get incensed if you start to criticize Israeli behavior. This is simply self-defense. What are we supposed to do with these rockets coming through? I mean, that, and that you can't argue very well with them because they have this blind spot. The fact that their own policies and their own history have created the conditions to generate this resistance, they don't even recognize it as resistance. What they'll say is it's just terrorism. So we've got a real problem here. The latest polls show like over 90% of the Israeli public fully support the operation, this genocidal attack on Gaza.
Well, I mean, this goes back to the idea that the way that you characterize David Harris as living in a very tightly defined world.
That's right.
It goes back to that same idea. And that's the same way, that's how I see, this incident that happened in Ferguson, Missouri, with police brutality. I'll tell you, some folks just cannot get out of their way of thinking about things. There are 350 million people in America and billions in the world, and not all of them are going to think the same.
Right.
And and we think the way we think based on our experiences. We are a sum total of our experiences. You got to get out more, folks. That's what I say.
Well, I mean, and you have to be able to step back from your own behavior. You have to be able to say, okay, I might think that I'm acting in self-defense, but how is it that the rest of the world can disagree with me? I mean, can all those other people be wrong? Don't they have some point? But many, many people can't do that, right? I mean, they're bound to their communities. We know now in Israel that it's physically dangerous to come out and protest the government. There are a few journalists, Israeli journalists, who have in fact written against the policies of the government. they now require bodyguards. So it's very difficult, obviously, for someone who hasn't been out, who's only grown up in an Israeli Zionist community, to be able to abstract from this and make some sort of objective judgment on their own behavior. It's very, very difficult.
Okay, we have 1 minute left, Professor Davidson. Why don't you end it? Can you end it on an optimistic note?
Well, it seems to me optimistic. It's an optimistic sign that the numbers of people who now recognize that there's something wrong with the Zionist scenario and a state designed for just one group. There's something inherently wrong with that. The numbers of people who see that have gone up and are getting larger and larger and larger. And hopefully at some point in American politics, you get a tipping point where this becomes a voting issue, and then, we can back off.
Okay, thank you, Professor Davidson. You know I appreciate you being a guest on my show, and we'll do it again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was Professor Lawrence Davidson. I'll see you next week with a great guest again.